Most of you watching this video probably know that we've had 47 presidents in American history, or 45 unique men. But these 45 people aren't the only ones who have been in charge of the country in some capacity throughout our entire history. Today, I'm going to talk about a list of 33 more people I've come up with that have held a title that has some sort of tangential similarity with the President of the United States without being a direct equivalent. Some of these are way more of a stretch than others, and I want to immediately clarify that I don't think any of these 33 men and women should be included on a list of United States presidents. I just think it's fun to look at all the leaders of any given country to understand its history, and the United States is no different. I've broken these almost presidents into 4 different categories: the colonial leaders, the pre-constitution leaders, acting presidents, and a few special cases that don't neatly fit into the other 3 categories. I also want to give a shout out to JJ McCullough, one of my favorite YouTubers, for making a video very similar to this one, where he covers specifically the acting presidents and the Continental Congress presidents, but there are several more categories you'll see that I've added here, and also one part of his video is now outdated since it was made in 2018, which we'll get to later. Timestamps will be left down below, and without further ado, let's start talking about the almost presidents of American history. So, if you watched my video on American wars before the year 1776, you would know that about 40% of American history occurred before we even declared independence. The rulers of the 13 colonies, the individual entities that would go on to form the United States, were English and British monarchs. From the first English settlement in 1585 all the way until American independence in 1776, there were 11 different monarchs that ruled over the colonies. Obviously, the monarchs were not remotely similar to the office of the President of the United States in plenty of ways, and the United States made a strong effort to differentiate their chief executive position from the perceived tyranny of the British Crown. The position was a constitutional monarchy, meaning that the king or the queen did not have absolute power over Britain and her dominions, but the monarchs of the 17th and 18th centuries certainly held more influence than King Charles III does today, especially before the English Civil War led to political reform in the early 1650s. One thing that remained consistent throughout English history and remains true to this day is the monarch's position as head of state, meaning that they perform the symbolic and ceremonial duties of the country, one of the few things they share in common with the President of the United States. Elizabeth I, James I, and Charles I were the first 3 monarchs that oversaw English colonization prior to the English Civil War, which began in 1642. The war resulted in Charles I's execution and the abolishment of the monarchy. Oliver Cromwell, the leader of the victorious parliamentarian faction, became Lord Protectorate of the Commonwealth of England, Scotland, and Ireland, as well as their associated territories, including American colonial possessions. The position of Lord Protectorate was totally different from the monarchy. It was just a head of state position with power consolidated primarily into one person. The position even passed down to Cromwell's son, Richard, when he died. See, nothing like a monarch whatsoever. Through a complicated series of political events that began with the distrust of Richard Cromwell in the Lord Protectorate position, the English monarchy was eventually restored in 1660, with Charles I's son, Charles II, taking the throne. 7 more monarchs succeeded Charles II and oversaw the American colonies, starting with James II, then Mary II, then William III. Under Anne's reign, the English monarchy became the British monarchy with the unification between the English and Scottish governments in the year 1707. After Anne, there were 3 Georges in a row, the third of which was the infamous Mad King, George III, who was in power throughout the entirety of the American Revolution. Like I said earlier, the only tangible similarity between the English and later British monarchy and the President of the United States would be that they were both heads of state of the same region at different times in history. But there was an obvious disconnect between the monarchs and their colonial possessions. In fact, none of them even set foot in the New World. The first British monarch to set foot in the United States borders would be King George VI, all the way in 1939. I should also mention that the French, Dutch, and Spanish also had colonies in what would later become the United States, but I'm choosing to omit their rulers from this list because the United States was mainly a successor state to the British 13 colonies when it was founded, and if they were included, we'd just be talking about monarchs this entire video, which are the most distantly related to President of the United States out of anything I'll talk about today. The next category of almost president I'm going to talk about are the presidents of the Continental Congress, of which there were 14. This was the American head of state position in the in-between era, after independence had been declared from the British, but before the system of the modern presidency was established through the Constitution in 1788. So you might be saying, why aren't these guys considered presidents of the United States? Why shouldn't legendary founding fathers like John Hancock and John Jay, who were president of the Continental Congress, be included in our history textbooks as some of the first real presidents? The country had legitimacy at this time, being recognized by major powers, especially after independence from the British was officially ratified with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Plus, the position was called president and it was elected, albeit by the Continental Congress itself and not by the public. But to make the argument that the president of the Continental Congress and the president of the United States are the same or even similar positions would be flat out incorrect. When describing the lack of similarities between the two jobs, a historian named Edmund Cody Burnett explained, "The president of the United States is scarcely in any sense the successor of the presidents of the old Congress. The presidents of Congress were almost solely presiding officers, possessing scarcely a shred of executive or administrative functions, whereas the president of the United States is almost solely an executive officer, with no presiding duties at all. Barring a likeness in social and diplomatic precedents, the two offices are identical, only in the possession of the same title." The other problem you're going to run into when trying to add these guys to a list of United States presidents is, well, where do you start? Sure, the answer seems simple enough. The first president of the First Continental Congress, which would be a man named Peyton Randolph, who began his tenure on September 5th, 1774. But wait a second, the United States wasn't an independent country in 1774. The first shots of the Revolution hadn't even been fired yet. Okay, well, how about when Congress declared independence on July 4th, 1776? That would make John Hancock the first president. But is a country really a country just because it says so? The way we usually determine whether a country is a real country, at least nowadays, is whether other countries recognize them. So, by that logic, June 23rd, 1777 would be when America became a real country, because that was when the first outside nation, Morocco, chose to recognize it, which conveniently would still make John Hancock the first president. But wait a second, the American Revolution was still being fought in June 1777, we hadn't technically won our independence yet. So that would mean the first president would be Thomas McKean, who was in office when General Charles Cornwallis's surrender was finalized at the Siege of Yorktown on October 19th, 1781. But hold on, was the revolution really over until Britain and America made it official with the Treaty of Paris on September 3rd, 1783? That would mean Elias Boudinot was the first president because he was in office at the time. You could also say Samuel Huntington was the first president because he was in office when the Articles of Confederation took effect on March 1st, 1781, marking the first official form of government in the United States. See how confusing this can get really fast? I just listed out 6 possible dates we could use to mark the beginning of the presidency, and there are probably even more I'm not thinking of right now. Sure, literally no one is going to argue Morocco's recognition of the United States should be our starting point, but I hope this demonstrates that it's so much cleaner to consider George Washington's 1789 term as the start of the American presidency because, well, it was. Any rational historian wouldn't consider the 14 presidents of the Continental Congress an equivalent position to the President of the United States because the jobs were too dissimilar and there's no agreed upon starting date. Alright, next we have 3 people who, out of everyone I'm going to talk about today, probably have the best case to make that they were basically the President of the United States. All 3 of these people were elected on a presidential ticket, had legitimacy in their role in presidential power through the Constitution, and were also legitimized by the president they were serving under. Who are these people? Well, they're 3 of our relatively recent vice presidents, George H.W. Bush, Dick Cheney, and most recently, Kamala Harris. So why these 3 and not other vice presidents like J.D. Vance or Joe Biden? Well, these 3 were all given the powers of acting president by the presidents that they served under using the 25th Amendment, those being Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, and Joe Biden respectively. Section 3 of the 25th Amendment, adopted on February 10th, 1967, reads, "Whenever the president transmits to the president pro tempore of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives his written declaration that he is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, and until he transmits to them a written declaration to the contrary, such powers and duties shall be discharged by the vice president as acting president." So why were Reagan, Bush, and Biden unable to discharge the powers and duties of their office? That sounds a bit dramatic, right? Well, actually, no, not at all. The 4 times this has happened in American history, once with George H.W. Bush and Kamala Harris, and twice with Dick Cheney, have all been because of colon procedures where the president was unconscious, leading to some people to jokingly call this the colonoscopy amendment. These 3 vice presidents were all acting presidents for less than a day each. On July 13th, 1985, George H.W. Bush held the position for 7 hours and 54 minutes while President Reagan got colon cancer surgery. On June 29th, 2002 and July 21st, 2007, Dick Cheney held the position for 2 hours 15 minutes and 2 hours 4 minutes respectively, while President Bush got colonoscopies. And finally, most recently, on November 19th, 2021, Kamala Harris held the position for 1 hour 25 minutes, while President Biden also got a colonoscopy. It's an interesting coincidence that each period we've had an acting president has been shorter than the last. An acting president has all the same powers and duties of the regular president, but the nature of the position is inherently temporary and therefore distinct from the actual president. president. So should we add these instances to a list of presidents of the United States because they all held the same powers that a president would? No, that would just be silly. Plus, one of the three, George H.W. Bush, went on to be an actual president anyways. Not to mention, nothing remotely interesting happened while any of these three individuals were acting president. The biggest thing of consequence that happened was during the July 21st, 2007 instance, where Dick Cheney wrote a letter to his grandchildren as president of the United States to prove that it had happened. The acting president position has a different name for a reason, so we of course shouldn't canonize them as official presidents of the United States, but they are an interesting footnote in the history of the presidency. Finally, I want to take a look at three more people who have held the power of the President of the United States, kind of. These three are all very unique cases that have only happened one time each in American history, and I doubt anything similar will happen anytime soon. Let's go in chronological order here. The first of these three is a man named David Rice Atchison, the President pro tempore of the Senate from 1846 to 1849, and again from 1852 to 1854. For those who don't know, the President pro tempore is a position elected by senators that serves as the second highest ranking official in the Senate behind the Vice President. It usually ends up being the most senior senator of the majority party at any given time. For example, as of the recording of this video, the President pro tempore is Chuck Grassley, who just turned 92 years old and has been serving in the Senate for almost 45 years. When Atchison was serving as President pro tempore, it was the third position in the presidential line of succession, behind the President and then the Vice President. That later got changed in 1886 and then changed again in 1947, but at the time it was the third spot. When Zachary Taylor won the 1848 election, he was meant to be inaugurated on March 4th, 1849. That was the inauguration day back then instead of January 20th. That year, March 4th fell on a Sunday, and Taylor did not want to get inaugurated that day because of religious concerns, so he pushed his inauguration to a day later on March 5th. Since James K. Polk, the prior president, had a term that constitutionally ended on March 4th at noon, along with his vice president George M. Dallas, that would technically make David Rice Atchison acting president of the United States for one day, between James K. Polk's term ending on the 4th and Zachary Taylor getting sworn in on the 5th. Did Atchison do anything whatsoever with his power? Well, no, not at all. He didn't even acknowledge the title itself. See, historians generally agree that the presidential succession doesn't depend on taking the oath of office, and when one presidential term ends, the next automatically begins. Plus, Atchison's term ended on the same day as Polk's, and while he was re-elected to the President pro tempore of the Senate the next day, the reality is that because Atchison technically wasn't President pro tempore for that one day, he therefore could not have been part of the line of succession. This whole situation is totally confusing, and it's still unclear what exactly the correct protocol would be here, but thankfully it was just one day in our country's history, and therefore not very consequential at all. Either way, Atchison's grave reads President of the United States for one day, despite him never claiming the title himself. Our next guy was voted into power as chief executive in a position called the Presidency that oversaw territory within United States borders, but he absolutely was not a president of the United States. That's because Jefferson Davis was instead the president of the Confederate States, the one and only during the 4 years it lasted. I don't even want to talk about this one for too long because I don't think the Confederacy deserves any sort of legitimacy as a government whatsoever. The reality of the situation is that the Confederate federal government was less centralized than their Union counterpart. I mean, that was kind of the point besides the enslaved elephant in the room. As president of the Confederate States, most of Davis's decision-making revolved around military matters. They were fighting the bloodiest war in American history after all. The Confederate government was officially dissolved on May 5th, 1865, and Davis was captured just 4 days later. Like I said at the beginning of this video and have mentioned throughout, I don't think anyone I'm talking about today should be added to the list of American presidents, but especially Davis fits this bill. After all, this was a separatist movement that explicitly didn't want to be part of the United States, and while unsuccessful, was the largest threat of any breakaway movement in US history. The final person I'm going to be talking about in this video is the wife of a president, that being Edith Wilson, the wife of Woodrow Wilson. So why should a first lady make this list? Well, on October 2nd, 1919, Wilson suffered a severe stroke. This wasn't his first, but this one left him entirely paralyzed on his left side and even partially blinded. Until his term ended on March 4th, 1921, he was incapacitated and stayed behind closed doors for the most part, with only one cabinet meeting and one public appearance during the year and a half that I could find records of. There was no clear protocol on what to do here, because the 25th Amendment, which outlined the process of replacing a president should he be incapacitated, was not ratified for another 48 years after this happened. Members of Congress urged Vice President Thomas Marshall to take control, but Marshall refused and did not want to be seen as power-hungry and going against the will of the American people and the Constitution. Many of Wilson's top advisors didn't interact with him whatsoever during this time, including cabinet members and even Vice President Marshall himself. Edith Wilson was the person with the most responsibility regarding the flow of information to the president, and it's even been suggested that she was the one signing official documents and calling the shots on her husband's account, which, given the evidence, is not only a possibility, but a likelihood. Before anyone comments that by this logic I should also add Jill Biden to the list, the scenarios regarding Woodrow Wilson's health and Joe Biden's health were fundamentally different in terms of severity and how the flow of information was controlled, though there were absolutely issues with President Biden's health as well. That was clear as day. Due to Edith Wilson having such a strong influence during the last year and a half of the Wilson administration, plenty of people refer to her as the first female president, although she obviously never officially obtained this title through constitutional processes. Like I said, it's almost an irrefutable fact that she had more control over the executive office than the president himself at the time, and with her iron grip over the flow of information in the White House, there's more than enough evidence for the claim to be made that her role went far beyond that of any other first lady in American history. So there you have it, the list of 33 almost presidents of the United States that I've come up with. Some of these have more validity than others for sure. I've never seen someone unironically make the case that King George III was basically the president of the United States, but there are plenty also here that significantly blur the lines of holding near absolute presidential power without actually occupying the office. Is there anyone I missed in this video that should be added to the list of almost presidents? Which one do you think was the closest to being an actual president? My vote would be for Edith Wilson, because while she never had an official constitutional title, I think she made more decisions explicitly tied to that of the presidency than anyone else on this list did. Well, that's all I got for you this time. This is Bay State History, signing off.